Greetings, friends, and welcome to another episode of the World Tree Podcast. I'm Arnold Schroeder, and I'm here with, I guess, six friends. Um, and I'm in Portland, Oregon, and my long-term consistent background is in environmental politics, but I wanted to be an evolutionary biologist. It's just that what I wanted to study was being destroyed. So I ended up doing politics with my life instead. But yeah, evolutionary biology and anything related to behavior is sort of like a primary area of research interest. I don't have much formal education beyond community college science classes, math classes, but I did actually just publish a paper with a DOI. So I figure now that I've formally contributed to the scientific literature, it's kind of like I'm a scientist.
Yeah, yeah. Hi, I'm Pauli. I'm in Helsinki, Finland. Uh, I have an academic background. I'm pursuing a doctoral degree at the moment. In kind of landscape level Arctic plant ecology. My education, I have a master's in ecology and evolutionary biology, and another in geoinformatics. Um, I guess through that, my research interests are kind of like an ecosystem level, like interactions and like landscape level processes. But like honestly, it's very much not limited to those things. And the papers we're going to be discussing today have really tickled me as well. So looking forward to it.
Okay, I'm Darlene, or D. Preferred pronouns are Z or hers, but I like any pronouns depending on the mood and shape of the sun. So, um, I have a background in academia. I started off in engineering. And sort of like childhood science-ness was kind of like physics oriented, then took a chemistry oriented approach after that, and then just fell into tech, and tech was just like the thing. That was just I was going to build stuff. I built stuff for a while. I did electrical engineering, computer engineering at the same time. To some degree, it was just like the same courses overlapping, but I took a lot of computer hardware as well as electrical engineering. And my schooling kind of stayed in Toronto. I'm from Toronto. That's also based here. Hi. And I then pursued like academic work, partially continuing on sort of like inventor sort of like thought process for quite a while. And then sort of like also was into philosophy, and then I kind of managed to read enough science still to feel like that's something useful that I can talk about. A lot of my like probably intuitions come from my PhD, which are was mostly done in doing deep neural networks for modeling electrophysiology data. That was the majority of the time that I spent in my PhD doing work. So I have sort of, I would say, like my empirical work was slightly related to that, and then also like did like a lot of just intuitive training of these neural networks, which I hope is valuable in this conversation. Yeah. And World Tree Projects, I wanted to say that regional survival strategies is something I'm still very interested in, as well as this coevolution type stuff.
All right, y'all. How's it going? I'm Josh. I'm here in New York. I guess I do almost get a degree in applied mathematics before completely ripcording myself out of academia. Um, so yeah, I guess I have like some degree of academic competency, what I guess you could say. I'm generally really interested in like cross-discipline, like cross-discipline crosstalk, right? Science is talking to each other. It's one of the things I'm most interested in doing with World Tree is sort of like putting these things up against each other and sort of making them interact because everybody's so siloed off. Also, still really interested in regional survival strategies, embodied political cognition. Yeah, that's my world tree stuff.
Oh yeah, and now it's my turn. Yes, I have an academic background as well. I actually have a PhD in physics. I got it like 30 years ago, studying um, pattern formation and turbulence. As an experimenter, I wasn't a genius egoist. I was an experimenter. So, um, and let's see now. Yes, I did a couple of postdocs after that, and then got a professor job. And I was professor for 13 years at University of New Orleans until because I had small children and stuff, we left after Hurricane Katrina kind of destroyed everything. And then I actually got a job here in Louisville. By the way, I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. We've been here ever since, right? I got like a fellowship at the cancer center here to do medical physics, radiation therapy. And that was I didn't know anything about anatomy and stuff, so I listened to these what do you call them? Junior doctors discussing things I couldn't understand what they're talking about, right? So I did a little bit of anatomy study and I think pattern formation and turbulence is very biology-ish anyway, uh, and yeah, I have a whole bunch of papers. I did lots of research. I haven't written any papers since I left academia, though. Then after big capital took over all the hospitals, I got kicked out, and because when the hospital consolidated, they didn't want me there, right? I was already an old, nobody wants to hire an old guy, So speaking of, well, I shouldn't get off topic here, but still talking about myself. Then after that, I went into data science, which was something I could do. I always hated programming because it was torture when I was young. But then I discovered that it was actually pretty easy and fun. They completely, with these whatever languages like Python and such, it was a lot easier and nicer and more. So I did that for the last. Well, I did the medical physics things for 7 years, and I've done this for like 5, 6 years. Now I'm retired, so I can do things like read papers about octopus brains, and I'm very content about that. And I also have other research. I've been studying for a few years general relativity and quantum field theory. That's interesting stuff, and I have some ideas I'm trying to put together. So if it actually works, I'll need an institution to back me up, and voila. So there we are. So yeah, let's talk about consciousness today.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm in Spain near Barcelona. I'm a painter, but I have like a broad interest in science, I would say. I started in academia a few times, but I never held on more than like 2 semesters in one subject. So I didn't pursue that more. But yeah, I think I'm interested in a lot of different stuff, and also interested in integration of all those disparate fields of science, and also interested in what science and biology can tell us about like the crises we're facing as humans and all that good stuff. Yeah.
All right, so the many references to octopus neuroanatomy are in reference to what did we identify? I don't have the document in front of me. Was it just 2 papers that we said we were all gonna like kind of try to read, or that we considered sort of core, right? One was where is it like to be an octopus? Yeah, okay. And then the other was a paper called The Computational Boundary of a Self Developmental Bioelectricity Drives Multicellularity and Scale-Free Cognition. But the former is a pretty good example of what on earth the latter might be talking about. I guess that I just heard from Darlene that this paper is getting a fair amount of attention right now. There's something very just sort of like conceptually delightful about it. And I definitely took to it instantly. But the core of it, I'm not going to go into it very much. I'll let everybody else talk about all its fascinating uh, intricacies and implications, but the core of it is that the octopus nervous system is structured such that there is, contrary to a vertebrate nervous system, for instance, uh, considerably greater abundance of neurons in the peripheral nervous system in the 8 octopus arms than there are in the brain. And if indeed it is the case that consciousness is, let's say, an emergent property of, or let's just say happens to be spatially concentrated wherever there's like the greatest density of neurons, it raises the interesting question of whether there is independent consciousness in any given octopus arm. So the paper is called "Where Is It Like to Be an Octopus?" Under the supposition that perhaps it's like being in 8 different places, or I guess 9 different places, but that there might be independent fields of consciousness in any given octopus arm, and then presumably another one in the head. Um, and that is one of many ways of kind of getting into a whole vast range of questions about the relationship between, about the nature of consciousness, but also about how matter figures out how to self-organize into living systems in general, and where we should kind of assign, at what scales of self-organization of the material world should we kind of assign some level of agency or goal-directedness or cognition or even consciousness, perhaps. Um, and so the other papers that were suggested, in addition to the computational boundary of a self, um, while we considered these two, Where Is It Like to Be an Octopus and the computational boundaries paper to be kind of like our fundamentals that we were discussing, we also, as sort of like optional reading, tossed into the mix a paper called Biological Relativity Requires Circular Causality, but Not Symmetry of Causation. So where, what, and when are the boundaries? That sort of like classic of far out biological and physical speculation, Morphic Fields by Rupert Sheldrake. And then another paper by the author of the Computational Boundaries of the Self paper with a few co-authors on planarian regeneration as a model of anatomical homeostasis. Core of that paper being that it seems like planarian bodies know what anatomy to what aspects of its anatomy should go where. It's sort of without some of the sort of like classic assumptions about time dependent patterns of gene expression differentiation and stuff like that being met. It seems like there's some other source of information or knowledge about anatomical organization. So that's like my incredibly cursory, hasty overview of where it is like to be an octopus, and what that has to do, and what the sort of like tentative unifying themes of these papers we read might be. And that's all the introducing I'm gonna do. But then I guess we can open it up to what anybody wants to say about anything, but maybe in particular what people just kind of thought about this Where Is It Like to Be an Octopus paper, like what struck them about it, if they think that this is right, if they think there's a possibility the core thesis is true.
I think one of the like technical points that I think makes the case for the divided selfhood of the octopus. They talk about somatotopic representation, right?
Okay.
How the octopus in its central nervous system doesn't have an idea of which parts of its tentacles are where and so on. It's more of a like a general overview, but then the arms themselves have a map of themselves,
Right.
which is, well, I don't know. I guess we're gonna go get into what is consciousness and so on. But like, there's this idea. I think like I was just thinking that going into like the actual anatomical or the findings in the paper, like the real things can get us maybe started. Also, like the division of the nervous system. Could talk
A
about
lot
that
of
as
it
well.
just depends upon, what you mean by consciousness, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
his argument is, but if you take his definition of what consciousness is as a given, and it's a pretty reasonable definition. I'm not going to, quibble about definitions of consciousness, But the one thing that struck me was this whole, architecture of its nervous system, where, okay, you have this complicated, he used the term hydrodynamic, oh no, hydrostatic, there's no bone to make a reference for the mapping for this somatotropic map that it would have. And so this makes it really, really complicated. So it must have, pre-programmed, uh, basically, I guess fixed points, if you like, of what to do here and there, because otherwise it just explodes in in complexity, and it's unmanageable at any scale, and so it's kind of difficult to believe that, if you think of consciousness as something that happens right here, right now, to me, as a unitary thing, then, you'd have to just like we turn off our unconscious, right? So that we can be conscious. I think it would seem to me that octopus have to turn off its arms so that its head can be conscious, or turn off its head and its other arms so that its arms could be conscious at a given time,
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, or I mean, to have them all be consciously simultaneously would be kind of like a Zoom call where, you know, 7 people are independently conscious, and
And
somehow
then like the
communicating.
coordination is the big question, I guess, right? Because then there's like the main one doesn't have any of like the motor or sensory input theoretically. I haven't like looked more into it besides the paper. But like that control module being so distinct and being later evolved is an interesting analogy, to say the least. But like as a structure is probably more of a question. So I think it came up in one of the other papers, something saying like it's not so much about the particular like nodes or like modules per se. There's like something about the structure or like connection, the structural build of whatever this architecture is. This is like something that I find deeply like connected to the neural networks work that I did, which is like some structure is fundamentally what like makes a breakthrough for the amount of data that can be essentially processed or ingested. So there's like a needing structure that in essence that like the complexity follows from is, I think, what I would suppose. And the complexity is like bounded into these like attractor states, because we talk a lot about this like attractor states again also in this like group of readings. All this like in terms of like chaos theory to complexity theory and so on, where Arnold's talked about like well articulated sort of like in at the very least a mental health perspective, that there's like different attractor basins that may be preferable, or a variety of different other reasons why in a landscape of possibilities there's like particular ones that are sort of like downhill. But then you kind of got to go uphill sometimes to go downhill. And these particular basins have a relation to what complexity emerges from the structure itself, like what particular trajectories are taken, how much like trajectories inform the information output of the particular model versus like the landscape itself being the information. There's like thoughts for me about a lot of that stuff that doesn't like stick to the octopus, but the octopus structure is kind of like where I would hone in a bit. Information about the activity and arm is structurally stored for minutes, possibly. Yeah. So then there's like there's a like a temporal element to the sensing in the particular arms. Presumably, whatever memory like we have like the most close analog to would be in that control module. It seems like would be our, I don't know, human starting point to think about these creatures. The bits about talking about, I mean, that's where I start to diverge from this like paper as like a conceptual model. Is like there's a lot of homology, like just perhaps like needless homology, where the point of the paper was to like try to escape that thinking at least as much as possible, and rather than present how the modules may be doing other things, they were kind of saying where the modules that we already have might be.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the case that the brain is incapable of proprioceptively distinguishing between individual arms, or it might not do so robustly. So then there's like the control module sort of strange blindness. Yeah. Yeah, it makes me think of neurodivergence.
One of the central arguments is to make an analogy with the split brain syndrome. Like, you know, we just like, you know, if you cut your corpus callosum, I don't know if that's pronounced correctly. Anyway, pretty close. Okay, that's okay. 5 points. So that you have these strange kind of simultaneous consciousnesses, you know, like for example, you can experience something on one side, but you can't talk about it, or et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, which kind of suggests to me that at least in mammals, you know, it's not really a parallel processing, if you want to, you know, use the brains are computers metaphor. It's not a parallel processor, but it's more like a time sharing computer, you know, where you only get to do a calculation once, you know, and then but you just do it really fast between different subsections of the computer, you know. So
analogy, like computationally, like missing the like the state space trajectory, kind of like thinking about it rather than it being like a particular like hardware that would time slice things, but more just like a particular stateful system. And as a result,
I think it would be more nested system. You have a whole bunch of attractors, you know, like whatever, eight attractors, and then you have a master attractor that turns on one or brings the other one into focus, as it were. You know, yeah. So you have one master attractor, one master system, and that thing's like controlling the other 8. You know, to some extent. I'm sure it gets feedback and like.
So yeah, I just meant the computational model we were working from. Yeah. But the octopus, like, yeah, having like a distributed like synaptic system is clear. Anybody else?
What I got from it was kind of that it has this octopus has this complicated body plan with all those like degrees of freedom for motion. So it kind of like outsourced some of the computation to the arms, giving them like more autonomy, like having them like quasi-autonomous agents. And then you have on top like this, I don't know, I kind of imagine it a little bit of like, if you think of computer games, that you have games where you like control the character directly, and then you have like point and click adventures where you click to some spot and then the character like finds its way like himself. And I read in another book like they did those tests with octopus where they had mazes where one arm would fit, but then to navigate the maze, the octopus had to use its eyes because it kind of went out of the water, and so it couldn't use the chemical sensors and the tentacles. So it had to use its eyes, and it took them some time to figure it out. Like it seemed hard for them, but they did it. Like, but still, it looked like the tentacle had also its own like movement of like feeling. No, like there was some sort of like top down thing happening, but then also this like bottom up thing. You know?
So it took the experimental subjects a while to like integrate what their arm already knew into like their visual system or whatever, to like use the
I don't know if it's that, or if it was kind of hard for them to tell their arm like go to like,
oh, I see.
exactly
Yeah,
this
yeah,
point.
right.
Yeah.
It says that the connection is really kind of not. I mean, that's part of the whole autonomy argument, is that there's, you know, they start counting neurons. You know, like the central brain's got like half. I don't know, a good chunk of it is in their brain, and then the rest of it is in the arms. But the connections between them are really sparse. You know.
Right.
And so that was and so that's what has to really, you know, delegate control, as it were, to the, especially since it's so complicated, because there's no reference, you know, there's no bone refer it's muscle coordination too. So yeah,
that's
pretty persuasive, actually.
And that's another point of connection with the left and right brain hemispheres and vertebrates. I mean, of course, we have all of these sort of like more functionally interconnected regions of the brain. There's little clusters of functional, like greater density of greater synaptic density. But then at the level of the hemispheres, it's really extreme, where the degree of interconnection in a given hemisphere is so much greater than between the hemispheres. And there's like a lot of functional segregation, which allow them, there has to be, it's this delicate, it's this dance, this walking of a very fine line, this, kind of like critical state type, like in a landscape metaphor, you're right on this like very narrow ridge where you have to have enough connection for them to coordinate, but you need to like segregate them enough that they can do truly different kinds of processing. And it's the breakdown. I thought that, just in terms of counting neurons, regardless of their connection, like connective architecture, it's like there's 45 to 50 million neurons in the central nervous system. And then the optic lobes, which some people attribute to the central and some to the peripheral nervous systems, have 120 to 180 million neurons. But then the peripheral nervous system, i.e. all these arms, consists of 350 million neurons. So, I mean, that's just nothing like, I don't know the ratios in vertebrates, but that is really, really, really different. And I think that the comparison to split brain patients is really interesting. For people who don't know, when the corpus callosum is severed, which is mostly done for the sake of controlling epilepsy, right? Like an epileptic seizure is this kind of like neural storm where too many connections are happening all at once and causes seizures and all that. So they'll just completely sever the connections between the two brain hemispheres, and it produces, like John was saying, there's all of these like really, really clear indications that these hemispheres are engaging in the world in very different ways, and that in a lot of cases they kind of don't, they're just like not seeing the same things or communicating with reality on the same terms at all. But in terms of like an attentional field, in terms of like a subjective moment to moment experience, I don't think that for the most part people report feeling like they're two different people who are like navigating the same body, right? Like that's I've never heard that as a characterization of uh whatever it's called.
Brain patients, I think, say something to the effect. Sometimes it depends on what they're up to. I think sometimes you like putting on clothes, and they say that they like find one side may know how to put on clothes correctly, and then others, like the other side, may not know how to do that. And then there's some things about like you not even realizing that some of those actions happen. So there's a like there's a pretty distinct they would be able to describe, but it's like two more like similar. I guess they would like describe something of just like the middle of the brain being just like taken out and like shoved into like a bunch of different limbs. Um, is kind of how I picture it. But then maybe like with less frontal development, I have no idea. It seems like it was evolved independently. That would be like an entirely yeah. Um, Huge topic to delve into more, but the way it's described in this paper, for sure, it just seems like primary and supplementary motor areas were just along like sticking out, putting the legs, putting the arms, whatever, and then there's some sort of coordination thing that's developed and looks different. Yeah.
Yeah, right. There's intermanual conflict in split brain patients where and it's hilarious because it's consistently, so it'll be like one brain hemisphere is trying to put on the jacket and the other brain hemisphere in control of the contralateral side of the body is like taking the jacket off or whatever, but it's always the left hemisphere and therefore like the right side of the body that's like performing certain actions, and the right hemisphere that's like disrupting them, right? They have like very like characteristic sort of forms of conflict or things that they'll get into conflict about. But often it seems like in a lot of those descriptions, the most I've read a few papers about split brain patients, and then Ian McGilchrist's second big book, The Matter with Things, is mostly where I know about it from because he goes into way more neurophysiological detail than he does in Master and His Emissary. And it seems like in a lot of the cases that he's describing, there's just a lack of awareness. Like rather than experiencing an attentional field where there's two distinct consciousnesses that are in conflict, people will just not know that the conflict is, they like won't know that they're like undressing themselves while they're trying. The experience will be that they're trying to dress themselves or whatever.
But as my understanding, most of the corpus callosum connections are for inhibiting the other side. I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Shut up. And yeah, and the whole in that one book, The Master's Emissary, I remember that basically the evolutionary necessity that he claims for having two different modes in your left and right or whatever is that you need specific attention to do something, but you also need to be aware of the world around you simultaneously. So you actually need two nerve centers, which I don't see why an octopus. I mean, if it delegates all of its perceiving the world to its arms, why would it need to have a split brain like that? I mean, because it already has a specific attention taken care of by its 8 brains, and,
Right.
And so the awareness of the world, oh, there's a shark coming, whatever. would just be the job of the eyes, I guess, you know. Whereas we have left and the right, and you know, mammals, even like, you know, birds, etc. You know, you can do you know, where they have the experiments about different attentions from the right and left.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems, you know, that like the whole evolutionary necessity should be the same, you know. So why would it? You know, it seems kind of a inconsistency there, I would say.
That one's an interesting one, like the evolutionary, like yeah, I guess do you use like an incentive model to kind of figure out the evolutionary, like I mean I try to think about it as like there's like and some sort of entropic possibilities, like, and there's just infinite of them. So independently evolved stuff to sort of like speak to how stable maybe some trajectories may see themselves, like bigger sort of gravitational pulls in sort of the solar system, like the big planets versus like atmosphere, no, asteroids. And there's like bigger trajectories, but they're all different looking. The octopus seems like it's like got overlap, but it's distinct. I'm tempted to say that like the like does anybody see anything about the octopuses in particular that are like socially valuable in particular, like the structure that they inhabit? Is it like we want to be like xenobiologists to some degree, and or like xenolinguists or something, that's like we're going to engage with them on some sort of different new level because they're alien forms of consciousness? Or are we looking at them because they like remind us about like they have like a strong like analogy to a system of beings? I mean, if we want to sort of like ask like the Zoom, like before we were saying something about like a Zoom meeting with like a bunch of people on the call kind of thing, and there's like different arms, and they're like the people on the Zoom meeting. Like how much does like the arms of the octopus actually inform the discussion about human engagement at all, if at all?
So you're saying that the arm coordination is analogous to us talking, right? I mean, because at some one point in the paper they say, oh, it has to have this coordination from the CNS to avoid like the arms colliding with each other, because there's no central control, and so it's sort of delegated that you know, as it were, experience to the arm itself. So one really interesting thing about that I found in the paper was the idea that, you know, and I saw like a documentary, which is really, really fun. My friend, the octopus, that's a really good one. Anyway, the one thing that was really interesting is that they're not social at all, you know, and a lot of, you know, theories of humans and such are intelligence.
Like playing games. I've seen many an instance of an octopus playing games. That to me is like a strong indicator of
yeah, but they play with their environment
or animal development.
Well, there's still
Yeah,
one
I mean,
exception.
sorry, John. Yeah, the paper does point to the emergence of domain general cognition is having potentially been influenced by sociality. So maybe it's like an evolutionary hold on or something like that. Just to your earlier comment, John, also about this sort of like evolutionary reasonableness of this sort of thing. I would think it would have to be sort of like Daniel was saying earlier, something that comes out of this sort of weird hydrostatic nature of the musculature. Like it seems like those two things would have had to develop sort of simultaneously, and that the ability to transmit information through this very sort of alien musculature, and the sort of the autonomy of the legs, but also like the sheer like infiniteness of articulation might necessitate this sort of weird disaggregated approach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah, I think definitely. Yeah.
I think in terms of, real quick, just in terms of sort of the evolutionary context of well, cephalopod neuroanatomy and cognition in general, I think there's this really interesting case to be made that because yeah, it's so frequently the case that sociality is cited as this kind of like essentially like a requirement is more or less how it's phrased in some evolutionary theory for really complex cognition, and octopuses uh, kind of contravene that. I think that what really is happening is that they open a lot of doors for us to see more plasticity than we might otherwise, and to understand social cognition in very broad terms. Because one of the things that's almost definitely happening in the history of the development of octopus neuroanatomy is that they're navigating their environment, and they're employing a theory of mind in order to just like not get killed or to hunt or whatever, right? They're interacting with like an environment full of other uh, conscious, agents who have motives and intentions. And so even if they're not in social aggregations, typically, then they are still like reasoning about other people's behaviors and experiencing some kind of embodied empathic reasoning about what other people like them might be experiencing or intending in a given situation. But then also there is that place off the coast of Australia, I guess it is, Octopolis, where they are social. And they aggregate in huge numbers. And I think that shows this other really interesting thing. Like you see across a lot of species, like various types of like bonding and play behavior and stuff that the species doesn't have a history of will develop in like captivity or where there's some really novel context. I mean, like that documentary, My Octopus Teacher, like that's not coming out of any long history of the octopus playing with its conspecifics or anything like that. But right away, it develops a vocabulary of behaviors that are totally recognizable to us as, like these like highly expressive forms of interpersonal connection, intersubjective comprehension. I mean, it's really beautiful and touching, and it shows that there's some like really pretty like generic features of complex minds and the sort of just like capacities that they have, even if in a given species history they're not like routinely deployed. It shows us that there's kind of other phenotypes that are always laying around latent in an organism that can emerge under a given set of conditions or whatever. Um, and then I wanted to say about just in terms of like kind of like what the organization of an octopus can tell us, about humans. I mean, I think that is interesting evolutionary information because we so often speak in terms of like species typical behaviors, and we don't expect to see anything that hasn't been occurring for millennia upon millennia already. So there's something, I think that there's like a general sort of reassertion of plasticity into biology that's happening right now. And I think that, provides us one more sort of data point in creating a biological understanding of humanity as capable of a wide range of like a wide behavioral repertoire. But also just in terms of like the actual information processing architecture of the octopus nervous system, I think there's like a real fun thing, where it's like we imagine in hierarchical mass societies, the ideal form that's always being posited, even though of course it's not very real, is that there's some like master oversight, like some agent in the system who has like a total overview of the whole system and can manipulate all its components from its like meta like arc, hierarchical perspective. And what is, of course, always happening in any of those systems is that more local forms of awareness are required, and they feed back, they influence what's happening at the top. But in Octopus, like just as a nervous system, it's like of course there's a continuum between pure centralization and an utter lack of it. But octopuses are somewhere like further on that continuum where there is more, it's just a more decentralized system. And so if you want to like search around in biology for functional analogies about how societies could be organized just in terms of their like information processing and decision making architecture, they provide this really interesting example of how the more, like just for like a less centralized form of it, that, I think we can always like look around at nervous systems for like models of social organization, and it provides us with a really interesting case in point.
In that my friend the octopus, I thought one of the most interesting was when this octopus completely, outfoxed, as it were, a shark that was chasing him.
Yeah.
He was like, "Oh, you idiot! You're such a doofus idiot," and he just like does all this deception stuff, like protect. That part of their whole physiology is all about deception and tricking other creatures, like changing your color. So he tries to avoid this shark by imitating algal, some algae leaves.
I was thinking about like the way that you were saying the meta and so on, like to just like keep like putting them on top of each other. Like the Noble paper talks about circular causation in a way that I really appreciate. I'm not sure it like spelled it out in a way that could make sense, but okay, so upward causation, like the axiomatic sort of like constructing to like some sort of conclusions, the downward causation to sort of infer states, I would say, from like observation, and then this like potential middling perspective sounds like where like trying to figure out how to make analysis. That's I don't know. The idea has come up in stuff that I've read about like coarse graining. There's like the notion that you can like figure out like the ideal gas law is like something that is possible to sort of observe in all sorts of gases. Most gases, I'm assuming, is just like some very interesting exceptions. That like all these like random activities of all these different things, is then like all these different molecules of gas, like they still result in this ideal gas law, which is like super duper stable. Yeah. And like physics has this sort of like super duper stable kind of vibe to it. And then like we're trying to talk about the potentially morphic fields that like embody the stuff that's not super duper stable, or like surround the stuff that's not super duper stable. To reference our Sheldrake, I also get a little bit like frustrated with like the meta thing. Like, how do you like science seems like it's potentially stuck on some sort of like theoretical level there, at least my understanding for sure. But maybe like this circular causation seems like one way to like overcome this logic, and then the sort of like figuring out where like the atoms start, and then sort of like some sort of group level analysis begins is like the sort of like the transition from atoms to the ideal gas law could be sort of like a state of cell to cluster metacellular or something. Levin 2019 paper talks about like the computational boundaries of each of those entities. So there's like a structural boundary, like with maybe like the atoms and stuff, but like computational boundary is something we haven't even necessarily gotten into yet. Which I would be excited to eventually.
Yeah, and that's like, I mean, so the obvious connection here is that we have this paper about cephalopod neuroanatomy that's saying, well, maybe whatever integrated, unified self an octopus experiences, maybe it also experiences a bunch of sort of sub-selves. And in so many different ways, in so many different disciplines, some form of this comes up. And this Levin paper seems like another one. I know that when I did my the first of my synthetic biology Fight Like an Animal episodes, I think 2 people sent me this paper as a, it seems like another one that a fair number of people have been reading and talking about. But it's really kind of coming from this, I mean, the really drastic oversimplification, but the like really comprehensible, ultra concise way to say it is that he's kind of looking at how biological form develops, about where the information resides that allows cells to self-organize into these exquisitely complex anatomies, and asking if there is some kind of agency at scales of organization well below the whole body of an organism, that have some kind of agency, some kind of goal-directedness, some kind of like sphere of awareness in which it solves problems or prefers one set of outcomes over another, that might be a form of selfhood, that might be sufficient for us to say. So whereas where is it like to be an octopus is asking, what is it like to be an octopus arm? This Levin paper has a section called "What is it like to be a pancreas?" And it's asking, a form of the same question, which is like, is there agency in subsystems of organisms that don't have what we would normally think of as cognition? Josh, was it you who you're the one who recommended this paper initially, right?
I think so, yeah. Oh shit, I just lost my thought.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. I'm sure it'll come back eventually. Yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of seems like what he's trying to get at is that the distance between goal directedness and like some sort of cognition is maybe just not quite as vast as it seems to be, right? That like at the very least there's like some sort of like correlation between the two.
Like goal directedness is sort of like an emergent coarse brain perspective of some other process that we can describe as happening underneath in some way. Like maybe there's goal directedness, or like, I don't know.
Yeah, I like what you said earlier about the sort of like downslope behavior. It does seem like it does seem like something that could flow from that. Like if you're thinking about just like energy flowing from, flowing downhill as it tends to do, over and over and over again. This sort of just like very simple goal directedness, eventually starting to sort of like carve out grooves in the universe, right? Almost like a glacier on like a hillside or whatever. And then, you know, the next time water runs through there, it's got the groove already. And so you start getting these sort of like built-in pathways, right? Which is, I think, sort of where he's trying to go with his stuff about bioelectric fields, which is in the planarian paper, I think.
Yeah, but also it seems like he brings up developmental bioelectricity like a lot, you know, like because that's also in the computational boundary paper. And it seems like that's kind of his it is interesting to compare it to Sheldrake in a way, because what you just said is like very Sheldrake, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it seems like where one of the places Levin is focusing is, yeah, in this notion that the electrical signaling between non-nervous system cells, because we're still talking about, you know, voltage gated, you know, we're still talking about kind of some of the same fundamental mechanisms that are involved in electric processing between neurons, that is actually really, you know, homologous with nervous system processing, and that it creates a kind of, you know, awareness and agency, and uses examples like I guess cancer is pretty wrapped up in bioelectricity, right? There's a both in the sense that it can be induced by insulating cells from electric signaling, so that the boundary of the cell shifts in a multicellular organism to the actual like cell, and it no longer is sort of allocating resources in a collectivist manner. But then likewise, I guess there's apparently some really promising interventions for cancers that, like once they've developed, involving sort of like reasserting the electrical connectivity.
Quite shocking. It was quite intense, those conclusions, to see like them asserting a theoretical model for how one might tackle a new method of tackling cancer. I have this like immediate suspicion that like with like a paper that's like describing some sort of like holistic connectivity like cure, um, in a sense it's sort of like
It
a
sounds pretty freaky, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But it's very compelling. It is a very compelling take on what's going on with cancer, like for it to be like a previous state of existence for the cell, and for the
Right.
cell to essentially just sort of fall back into that state, and for that to then result in this like growth of this particular cell at the cost of the collective that it was already in. Yeah.
It becomes a separate self because its boundary between, you know, it's now not, it has a boundary around it, so it experiences the rest of the body as being alien, and so now that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, he describes it as the sense of self shrinking or something like that, I think. No, like, so the sense of self of the cell shrinks, and now it's just concerned about itself and not communicated and integrate.
The conventional thing is they say, oh, there has to be these five, you know, the cell just mutates, and it's got to have all these five things that all go wrong in the intracellular mechanism, you know, like it's
Right.
it won't commit suicide. What is that called? There's a gene that tells it to kill itself. It's got to be turned off.
Programmed cell death or something.
Apoptosis. Yeah.
But this is I think this is a much better view of what it is, you know.
Yeah.
It's certainly a lot more interesting.
I think it's a view that can like transcend levels. Like,
yes.
That's why I sent the paper to you as well, because I was thinking about that, like from the perspective of scale-free cognition, and then you can also like you cannot only go down levels, you can also go up a level and say like you have this human superorganism, and and what happens when its light cone shrinks and its sense of self shrinks, and then you have a process that is quite similar to cancer, like where you stop communicating with your environment, and you're not integrated with it anymore, and you develop the same, like when you look at culture, you have the same symptoms like cancer, like you have like the explosion of exponential growth, more waste products, you don't care about the extracellular environment, metastasis and all that. And I think it's like the same process in a way. And I think I feel like Fight Like an Animal describes really well how the way our culture, our superorganism is structured, makes it that the people with like very small cognitive light cones are in the positions of power, and because of that, we like have this little problem we have right now, kind of like, yeah.
We have this little problem, yeah.
Yeah.
That was neat. I was thinking about like this whole like how this generalized the social organism, but like the kind of conclusion that this centralized system of power is the cancerous, part was kind of not where I went with that, but I think I kind of like that more.
Analogous to brain cancer, right? But
yes.
Yeah.
It's the executive portion, yeah. Yeah, and what I think is so interesting about that is that, in so many from like really conventional social science perspectives to varieties of like anarcho-primitivism and whatnot, there's this notion that the reason we are in the crisis we are in is excessive scale and excessive connectivity in like in the superorganism, in our social forms. But thinking about it in these terms of the shrinking boundaries of the self, of the people who are in charge of our society, this like contracted light cone of awareness in the Levinism, like there's really strong evidence that I've spent a lot of time, talking about and Fight Like an Animal, that there's a sort of unifying psychology among those in power of just, a reduced scale of awareness of anything other than immediate self-interest, and how it's not the connectivity of the system or the scale, it's the fact that it's hyper connected and at the scale it is in a physical sense, but that the awareness, the information processing isn't taking place on that scale. There's the cancer analogy is very, very, very precise in this case. And that gives us a different way to think about this stuff.
They also talk about anesthesia a little bit, like how the way I interpreted it was like anesthesia effectively kind of removes the anesthetized part from the body, like shrinks that self, and then we can generalize that as well to like the social organism, where the small cones at the top are like detached, that like it's like they're kind of anesthetized, they're not like feeling the entirety of the social organism in a sense.
One thing about the cancer analogy, though, I mean, I think that if just one cell goes haywire, I mean, the body deals with that pretty easily. It's only when you get like a group of cells that cooperate. So they sort of bring in the previous messaging and connecting, and so you get like a little. It's not just a bunch of autonomous cells that are bad are like against the body, but it's like a whole group of them that are cooperating against the body. So it's more like a revolution than it is like a anarcho-primitives that's going off into the woods or whatever.
Totally. Yeah, I was thinking about cancer as like as well in a social organism as like a revolutionary cell, say for the sake of argument. That was kind of trying to distinguish in my like kind of this kind of mind map between different kinds of revolutionaries or different kinds of like people who are opposed to current systematic structures of power, and kind of these kind of ideas where like it's easier to see, for example, or for me, coming from probably more of like an anti-fascist perspective, it's easier for me to see like ethno-nationalism as cancerous than a more like left-leaning thing, because it's more focused on recreating itself rather than, you know, finding new developmental pathways for the whole organism.
It's really
Which is
focused
really
on the other, the
interesting.
bad part. You know, the other is evil.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the nature of egalitarian politics sort of like implies that it's sort of like the solution to the cancer, like the cure kind of, because it does focus on like that sort of holistic environmental thing. It makes me think of the viable systems model, which is actually based off of like the interaction of various nervous systems and like sort of how that information is passed around. And so system 5, the system at the top, is the system that's responsible for policy making, but it's also responsible for interacting with the other systems outside in the environment in a
Yeah.
recursive model that sort of goes, you know, all the way down. And that's actually, I think, uh, Norbert Wiener is who Levin uses to make that chart, and I think it's the computational boundaries of the self. Um, yeah, I just found that kind of striking that like it does seem to be like this fundamental failure to like take into account the environment that it exists in.
Yeah, and then you could see, I mean, it's pretty striking because you can just kind of you can see all of these instances where this applies very precisely, like in the language of economics, the world, you know, you have externalities. They're like, oh, well, anything that is outside of this very narrow scope of calculations involving, you know, making money and advancing very narrowly defined self-interest, that happens somewhere else. That's out there, you know, it's like the boundary of the self has shrunk pretty drastically. And then conversely, so much of I mean, something I've talked about quite a bit is that so much of the kind of experiential predictors of participation in environmental movements is people reporting an experience of an expansion of a sense of connectivity or their sense of self kind of, you know, encompassing the world. And yeah, as opposed to, you know, contrary to the strategic assumptions of a lot of like environmental messaging, as opposed to people getting exposed to a lot of threat messaging and being like, oh my God, that's terrible. Like, I don't want my kids to starve or whatever. That just doesn't really actually seem to be what motivates participation. It's a sense of the scale of self. So yeah, I mean, it just actually brings up these really interesting questions of if you're kind of like searching around for models of social organization, there's just like a really strong argument to be made for looking at the incredibly like exquisitely integrated and highly successful models that, you know, are found in organisms with all these cells communicating and coordinating towards these extraordinary high level emergent ends.